Eric Weber, welcome to Berlin.
Thank you very much.
We are just finishing the next edition of American European Values series of conferences. You are for the first time at this.
This is my first one.
What are your impressions?
Very positive. It's quite wonderful to see how much we see compatibility between American and European values, because so often the American tradition thinks of itself as new and different, but in fact, of course, so many of us come from Europe and the European tradition. The nice thing is that the U.S. certainly invites and involves so many other traditions as well, but the truth is that so much of Europe has done the same.
Mm-hmm. We dedicate this conference to practical philosophy. What do you think about it?
I think it's vital and it's fantastic. And in fact, that's sometimes what Americans think they have of unique value, which isn't so unique anymore. It used to be perhaps at one point in time, but the world, I think, is really cherishing practical philosophy in a way that it didn't at one point in time. It used to be that abstract philosophy that was irrelevant was what was deemed to be most interesting and meaningful and profound. But in fact, philosophy is so important for life that that kind of way of thinking hopefully is beginning to recede, and that people are starting to appreciate the incredible value of practical philosophy, both in areas like medical ethics and sort of everyday life conditions, but also in the bigger picture where folks are wanting, it seems to me, public intellectuals to improve the debates we see in the public sphere, which are troublingly oversimplified sometimes.
In my view, you are a perfect example of practicing philosophy. Tell us something about your activity in Mississippi.
Well, thank you so much. My hero is John Locke, and so the fact that this conference is dedicated to a great advocate for public philosophy over a lifetime was one of the prime reasons I had to be here this year. And I follow his example, but also people he has steered me to, including John Dewey. And studying John Dewey, of course, you can't help but appreciate how important the philosophy of education is. And so when I came to Mississippi, which is one of the states in the United States with the greatest frustration in education, it was obvious to me how important it would be to think about the philosophy of education and democracy, another important topic for Dewey, in a place like Mississippi. And so one of the challenges for a place like that is just how deep the difficulties are, how long-lasting they have been. But on the other hand, as a philosopher, it's so often the case that it's difficult to identify, what's wrong and what's right, and yet in some cases it's quite clear. And that's one of the benefits of Mississippi, it seems to me, is that for an advocate in public philosophy, there are some very clear-cut issues which, if we were to make changes about them, we could bring about, it seems to me, great progress. And so it's been one of the places where I've had significant opportunities to write for the newspaper, to advocate, for things that I think need to change, for better practices in education, for thinking about progress democratically and overcoming some challenges of race. The other thing I want to add, though, is that Mississippi isn't unique in having these problems. It may have some issues accentuated, but it's also somehow a microcosm for the United States as a whole. And there are folks in philosophy who think that the only time you're doing public philosophy is when you publish in the New York Times or some sort of enormous forum. And I think there's great value in doing so and in increasing the visibility of philosophy. But at the end of the day, we participate in communities. And that seems to me is where we can have some of the deepest impact. I want to raise awareness at the national and international levels, but you'll always have a shallower impact at those levels than you can have at the local level. And it seems to me that's where my opportunities in Mississippi have been so rich. I've been able to have some very deep relationships that have been meaningful and enabled me to think with others about how to do philosophy better and how to engage in democratic practices better with the guidance of philosophy.
Okay. I think yesterday you gave a speech.
Yeah.
Tell us very briefly about this.
Well, my talk yesterday was in part a component of a book I'm writing called A Culture of Justice. And it has to do with the cultural conditions which can enable or frustrate the pursuit of justice. And in Mississippi recently, we've had a number of cultural issues that have been at the foreground. For instance, we have a flag which presently includes the Confederate battle flag. And for many citizens, that's deeply troubling because, in fact, Mississippi's explicit statement about why it joined the Confederacy was because it wanted to defend slavery. So you can clearly understand why some people would find that deeply troubling. And so many people who want to defend the flag will deny that it has anything to do with slavery, but in Mississippi, it's the most blatant place in which it was explicitly the case. And so when we have such trouble overcoming symbols of division and disunity, think about how much difficulty we're going to have overcoming actual situations that are problematic, right? So the first step in so many cases has to do with dealing with the symbols and the language we use, caring about others and so forth, before we can then even address the substantive deep problems in each person's life. And so my talk yesterday was in fact a component of that larger project called The Culture of Justice, in which I'm identifying a pivot point, it seems to me, between political philosophers in the mainstream, like John Rawls, and what the pragmatists have to offer. Because John Rawls puts his finger on the issue that self-respect is very important, and he realizes that if self-respect is frustrated in people, you can oppress them far more easily. But he doesn't have much to say about what to do about that. But the pragmatists are deeply concerned with culture and how to make culture intelligent, how to intelligently form and shape it, which is part of why education is so important for democracy. It's because it is the intelligent shaping of culture, right? And so it seems to me that if we bring what the pragmatists have to offer to this political set of debates about self-respect, we can see a really important pivot point for thinking about justice that has yet to be attended to sufficiently, I believe. And so my presentation yesterday was actually in response to the key challengers to my view, and those are often actually libertarians. I love liberty, I care deeply about it, but we need to care about everybody's liberty. And that's what I think gets overlooked sometimes, when we forget that young people in so many cases like Mississippi and elsewhere are systematically channeled into positions in which they're not going to have liberty. And so when we care only about things like negative liberty, we forget the conditions that are necessary for each person to develop as an individual who will have self-respect, who will be independent, and so forth. So if you care about liberty and you care about independence and you want to interfere minimally in people's lives, there are nevertheless obligations we have to try and enable everybody to be ready for those responsibilities.
Eric Venner, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.